So I've already made a video all about what makes a country. So if we just stick to the UN's figure of 193 countries, how should we rank them? By GDP, by average height, by number of physicians, by cucumber production, or by percentage of the population using improved sanitation facilities? With so many different metrics, how will one country ever know it's doing better than another? For example, the US probably likes to think it's a bit more developed than South Africa. However, the latter actually has a much higher health insurance coverage rate. Saying that, they probably need it because, like any good soap opera, they have a murder rate around 6 times higher. So because people are lazy, they tend to slot countries into broad groups. Probably the most common are first, second and third world countries. But what do these terms even mean? If your relative just died and left you a country, how would you take it from third to first? And what's really the best way to rank the countries? Firstly, let's establish what these terms mean. And it's a little bit more complicated than just rich versus poor. In fact, the meanings of these groupings have changed a huge amount since they were first coined. Originally, Switzerland and Qatar would have both been members of the third world. That's pretty incorrect by the way most people think about them today. Originally used by the UN in the 40s, the terms, just like hacky sacks, really broke out during the Cold War era. The first world were the capitalist Western-aligned countries, the second world were the communist Russian or Chinese-aligned countries, and the third world were all the countries sensible or uninterested enough to remain neutral. Since the end of the Cold War, which, like all good things, featured David Hasselhoff for some reason, the meanings of these terms have changed quite a lot. The first world is still home to many of the same countries it was back then, but the country's political stance is no longer a requisite for entry. Instead, these are just the most industrialised, prosperous and democratically free countries. The second world, which is far less used nowadays, again, just like Hasselhoff, generally refers to countries with a fairly good level of prosperity but might lack slightly on the freedom side of things. The third world is most commonly used to describe poorer countries that are lacking at least part in all three of the main criteria. Because of how ambiguous these terms are, people often debate where countries fit into the model. I mean, technically Putin is more popular with his own people than most Western leaders are, and even North Korea would argue everyone there is happy and healthy. Clearly there are some issues with this system of categorization, and not only because it's fairly derogatory to most countries that didn't either colonize or exploit their way to success. And in fact, many people are trying to move away from the three worlds model because of their stigma on the third world. Whether you call them developing nations, poorer countries or shitholes, you're likely to offend someone. So for this reason, people have devoted their careers to finding a scientific way of ranking the development of a country, because no one can be offended by science. You'll often hear politicians and economists talking about GDP, but that's just a measure of wealth. Countries like Saudi Arabia place pretty highly on GDP charts, but the Freedom House organization gave them a rating of 7 out of 100 for personal and political freedom. Recently, the Scandinavian countries have been the talk of Europe because they often rank so highly on happiness charts. But the most recent list topper, Finland, also has the 8th highest suicide rate in Europe, which is clearly somewhat contradictory. Therefore, to get a real measure of a country's development, we can't just look at one factor, we have to look at many. This is where the Human Development Index comes into play. Back in 1990, Marbel El-Haq formed a group of development economists at the UN's Human Development Report Office. There they looked to create a simple formula to measure a country's development, and to shift the focus of development economics from national income accounting to people-centered policies. While you could argue they've succeeded in the second point, the formula didn't end up looking all that simple. To boil it down, it combines 3 main measurements of a country's development into one score. It takes the life expectancy, the average time spent in education, and the gross national income per capita, and does some smart people calculations to make these into usable numbers. To get the final Human Development Index, they just times these numbers together and cube root it. As you can imagine, certain countries do very well in this measure, specifically the OECD countries, a group that are members of the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development. These countries, like the US, UK and Japan, remain some of the most highly developed countries according to the index. In 2007, the Human Development Index for the rest of the world was at the rates the OECD group was at nearly 70 years ago, back in 1938. There's been some debate in recent years about how accurate the HDI really is. The term Fourth World was coined to describe countries that are in the First World but have swathes of the population living in Third World conditions. To combat this, the IHDI was introduced, which would measure the inequality of a country and factor this into the equation as well. If you look at the list side by side, you can see the countries that lose out the most from this new measurement. The US alone drops by 9 places. So how can you raise your country's HDI ranking? Unfortunately for you and your newly inherited country, there's no straightforward path. There are a lot of things that many of the highly developed nations have in common. but there's almost always exceptions to the rule. Could it be having an open democracy and a fair judicial system? Well, China knocks that theory out of the water. Could increasing the number of people attending university work? Although this would likely raise the educational index part of the HDI, many countries like Russia and other Eastern European countries have high levels of education but often lack the national income and life expectancy to rank highly. Maybe do a China and strictly control your population growth. But again, countries like Russia have been declining in population at the same time their HDI rank has been declining too, so it can't be that. Could it be about industrialization? North Korea bucks the trend here with high industrialization but still manages to be one of the poorest countries in the world. On top of that, states like New Zealand and Iceland have very little industry and still do very well in HDI. There are other suggestions about what causes development. Interestingly, on one of the newest episodes of David Letterman's Netflix series, Melinda Gates says,
"No single country in the world has lifted themselves out of poverty without first making sure women have access to contraceptives."
There's certainly truth to this. Life expectancy includes infant mortality, which in several African countries is still at nearly 10%. However, Oceania, whose population is mostly made up of the highly developed OEC countries of Australia and New Zealand, has the second lowest use of contraception. Even Nicaragua, which ranks 124th on the regular HDI, has the 5th highest contraceptive use rate of any country. There are obviously thousands of things that could be seen to boost the Human Development Index. Not too many to talk about in this video, so to give a real world example, let's look at one of the richest, most developed countries out there. One that managed this development in a fraction of time it took others. Singapore. To give you an impression of just how quickly Singapore truly became the opposite of its name, in 1970 its GNI was just under $1,000. In that same year the United States GNI was $5,250. Just 40 years later in 2010, the gap between the two countries was very similar, but Singapore now sat at a GNI of $44,790. That's above countries like the UK, France, Japan and Canada, all from a country with less than half the land area of Greater London. So how do they manage to make this jump from what would arguably be a third world country to the very top of the first world? Well, luckily for me, the man credited with a lot of this success, the country's first Prime Minister after independence, Lee Kuan Yew, wrote a series of books and called one of them From Third to First World. Because the book is like 700 pages long, I'm going to cut it down into 3 main points. Firstly, the country has become the Zurich of Asia. The country is seen as one of the world's best places to do business. And that's in a continent that, until pretty recently, didn't have many destinations that your average faceless multinational corporation would feel safe doing business in. In his book, Yew tells of a time where Singapore was just beginning to have thoughts of development. Back then, the stock exchanges and financial markets would open in Zurich, then Frankfurt, followed in order by London, New York and San Francisco. The Zurich banks would open at 9 AM and the San Francisco banks would close in the afternoon. However, this meant there was a 7 or 8 hour gap in between. Singapore was perfectly positioned globally to bridge this gap and make a truly 24/7 global trade network. The second reason Singapore has been so successful is its harsh crackdowns on corruption. Compared to most of its neighbours, it does very well on this front. Yew attributes this not only to the tough sentences and laws imposed in the country, but also says that the corruption and bribery in other Asian nations is almost ingrained in their society. It's a way of life. Get a parking ticket? Pay a bribe. Need to get goods into the country without anybody knowing? Pay a bribe. Need to get a government contract? Just pay a bribe. Reportedly, Singapore has managed to widely remove this sentiment from its people, which is particularly impressive considering just a generation ago, they were pretty much all immigrants from countries where bribery was rife. In the late 1990s, Singapore ranked as the least corrupt nation in Asia and the 8th least corrupt in the world. However, probably the biggest contributor to the country's success is its location. Not only was it positioned well as a financial hub, but also as a trade hub. It sits at the mouth of the Malacca Strait. As we know from historical cases like Panama and Gibraltar, as well as not so historic ones like Crimea, access to the world's oceans and being able to cut trade route lengths by days or even weeks is an incredibly powerful card to hold. Another incredibly powerful resource is oil. In 2011, of the 87 million barrels produced every day, 15.2 million made their voyage through this one waterway. That's second only to the Strait of Hormuz, which for obvious reasons has a little more oil traffic. Singapore's development has come at a cost though. The media is highly state controlled and dissent is squashed when it arises. Political protests are almost never seen in the country, and for a highly developed nation they lack some of the liberal policies of its first world friends, like the fact that homosexual acts remain 100% legal. So clearly, of all the things that can make a country develop, some can be engineered and some are just about luck and fortune. Singapore has one thing that I think truly shows it's a developed and well-mannered nation. Remember when we were talking about improved sanitation facility use earlier? Well, in Singapore, you don't have a choice. Many elevators in the country have sensors to detect if someone's urinating in them, and you'll be fined $150 if you don't flush the toilet. Let me hear your theories about what makes a country develop in the comments, and maybe tell me what you think should be a Singapore-esque law in your country. Thanks for watching the video, please subscribe and like if you'd like to see more.